It was not the cold that coiled around my neck, though the late November air in the Blackwood Peaks was a damp, skeletal thing that gnawed straight to the bone. Nor was it the pervasive, suffocating darkness common to the deeper veins of the earth, the sort of absolute blackness that seems to press sound out of existence. No, what arrested my breath and locked the joints of my knees was the smell. The air inside the fissure, what the locals sometimes called the Whispering Mouth, and what the Forest Service officially designated as Cave 7A, unstable and strictly sealed off, was meant to smell of petrichor and damp earth, minerals and age. That is the smell of a healthy, static cave, a museum of geological time. But this smell, this was different. It was aggressively organic, heavy and dense, almost sickeningly sweet, laced with that distinct, unmistakable iron tang that sets off every primal alarm bell in the human nervous system. It was the smell of spilled life, rich and metallic, far too fresh to be a relic of some ancient, forgotten burial. It was the unmistakable, terrifying aroma of warm blood. I had been Elias Thorne for 22 years, a warden of these woods, charting the trails and managing the perimeters of the Blackwood National Forest. I am, by nature and necessity, a man of methodical skepticism. My world is one of fallen pines, GPS coordinates, bureaucratic forms, and the occasional lost hiker or bear sighting. I do not deal in ghosts or folklore, even when the job takes me into places named Whispering Mouths. I was here strictly because the severe storm 3 days prior had shifted the scree slope above the old sealed entrance, tearing a sizable, ragged hole in the reinforced concrete barrier. Protocol demanded immediate inspection and resealing, especially given the cave's known structural instability and its proximity to the less-traveled western boundary. I slipped through the jagged opening, dropping 20 feet down onto a dusty, uneven floor. The beam of my high-powered tactical flashlight cut a sharp cone through the suspended dust motes, illuminating the first chamber, a small, narrow gallery that quickly descended into a tight crawl space. I was checking the rock stability, cataloguing damage, thinking only of anchor points and quick-drying cement when I first saw them. They were high up, perhaps 7 feet above the floor, near a pronounced lip of stratified limestone. My light drifted over them accidentally, catching the surface in a way that made the texture suddenly visible, causing me to stop breathing mid-inhalation. They were drawings, clumsy, rudimentary, undeniably childish. The lines were thick, uneven, rendered with a disturbing lack of refinement, the kind of purposeful, heavy-handed stroke only a very young hand, still developing motor control, could produce. The images themselves were deeply unsettling. Distorted circles meant to represent suns, perhaps, or faces, stick figures with disproportionately large, gaping mouths, geometric shapes that looked like houses or maybe cages, surrounded by strange, spiky borders. They were repetitive, insistent, covering a significant swath of the cave wall, positioned well out of the natural reach of an adult who would need to stoop low to navigate the passage. But it was the pigment, the medium, that slammed the reality of the situation down upon me like a physical weight. The color was an impossible, deep, visceral red, a dense, maroon, almost black shade in the low light, but catching the flashlight beam, it yielded a terrifying sheen. It wasn't paint. It wasn't ochre or rust or some rare, iron-heavy mineral deposit typical of Paleolithic art. The material was thick, sticky, almost gelatinous in places, possessing a distinct cracked texture where it had dried quickly against the cool stone. It was undeniably organic. I stood there for perhaps 5 minutes, immobilized, the silence of the cave now feeling less like natural quiet and more like a held breath. The metallic smell was strongest here, heavy and cloying, sticking to the back of my throat. My mind, trained for 20 years in rational explanation, cycled through frantic impossibilities. Vandalism. No, nobody in Blackwood had paint this color or this texture. Some bizarre cult ritual involving animal sacrifice. Possible, but even the most dedicated practitioners of dark rites usually preferred isolation far from known entrances, and they certainly didn't tend to use the thick, clumsy artistry of a 5-year-old. I took the mandated photos first, a shaky series of shots, the digital flash momentarily turning the dark red into a horrific, glaring scarlet. I reached out a gloved hand, hesitantly, and touched the edge of one of the drawings, a particularly disturbing rendering of two angular headless figures connected by a tangled line. The material flaked slightly, adhering to the thick leather of my work glove. It wasn't completely dry. Not ancient. Not even old. These drawings were recent. Weeks, perhaps days. This realization, the temporal disconnect, was the first open loop that began to unravel my composure. The area surrounding Cave 7A is deep wilderness. The nearest town is 17 miles away, a small logging community with minimal population. The nearest established hiking trail ends 5 miles back. The idea of children, unaccompanied or otherwise, finding and accessing this highly dangerous, unstable cave entrance was statistically impossible, logistically absurd, and personally terrifying. Children do not simply appear in the deep, sealed wilderness and begin decorating hazardous geological formations. I pushed deeper, navigating the narrow space. My light revealed more walls, similarly defiled. The drawings repeated their motifs, the jagged suns, the hollow figures, and a new, more disturbing addition, a series of repeating concentric spirals, drawn not with a brush, but seemingly smeared on with the flat of a small hand or finger. There was a sense of frantic urgency to the work, a lack of artistic consideration, as if the creator was hurrying to record a message before time ran out. I knelt, inspecting the floor for signs of the artists. The dust here was fine dry talc, undisturbed save for my own heavy boot prints, but after a careful, slow sweep of the beam, I found them. Just barely visible, pressed into the finer dust close to the rock face, were tiny impressions. Not full footprints, but clear indents consistent with the sole of a child's small boot or shoe. They were narrow, shallow, and crucially, they were only heading in one direction, deeper into the cave. There were no corresponding prints leading back toward the entrance. My professional skepticism fractured then. The methodical park ranger, the man who trusted data and procedure, was overwhelmed by the primitive, chilling fear of the unexplained. The facts arrayed before me were screaming. A secret, difficult-to-access location, fresh blood used as pigment for frantic, childish warnings, and footprints that implied the children had entered and never returned. I pulled out my field knife, scraping a heavier sample of the red substance onto a small piece of filter paper, intending to seal it for later analysis. As I illuminated the scrapings, the texture became painfully clear. It was thick, heterogeneous, with tiny, almost imperceptible fibers embedded within the dark paste. And the smell, concentrated on the paper, was overwhelming. It was the smell of the slaughterhouse, the surgeon's table, the battlefield, concentrated hemoglobin. I had to confirm it definitively, not just for my report, but for my own sanity. I used the tiny testing kit I carry for unusual toxins or biological residue, a simple, crude test for basic protein structure and iron content, usually used to confirm if a discarded substance is urine, vomit, or something more dangerous. The result was instantaneous and damning: high iron, high protein, positive for complex mammalian hemoglobin. It was human blood, the blood of children, used to draw haunting symbols on the walls of a forgotten cave deep within the earth. I stood up too quickly, hitting my helmet on the low ceiling, the sharp clang echoing through the heavy silence. The immediate shock gave way to a surge of adrenaline, urging me to retreat, to run and raise the alarm, to get out of the suffocating, bloody chamber. But the warden's code, the duty of responsibility, locked my feet to the ground. I couldn't leave. Not yet. If the children were still down here, trapped, hurt, or worse, their time was running out. I moved forward, dropping down into the next passage, which opened into a larger, more vaulted area. This section of the cave felt older, the rock face smoothed by millennia of running water. Here the air was significantly colder, and the metallic odor was beginning to be undercut by something else, a faint, sour odor of decay, slight but undeniable. The drawings in this chamber were different, more complex. They were less symbols and more attempts at structured communication. One wall was dominated by a huge, sprawling depiction of a pathway, a winding, complex line that branched into several dead ends before terminating in a large, abstract shape that might have been a door or perhaps a deep pit. Along the path were smaller, detailed annotations. These were not the simple stick figures of the outer chamber. These were small, highly specific objects rendered in the same ghastly medium. One drawing depicted what looked unmistakably like a broken, hinged toy, a rabbit perhaps, or a dog, rendered with astonishing, desperate detail, positioned right next to one of the branching pathways. Another segment showed what appeared to be a cluster of large, smooth stones, also marked with blood. It was a crude map, an intentional effort to document a location, a path, or perhaps an escape route. The sheer volume of blood required for this sprawling gallery was staggering. It wasn't just a fingertip dipped once. It was a sustained effort, suggesting a substantial source or perhaps multiple sources. The idea of one child sustaining that much trauma, or worse, a group of children being subjected to something that caused such a massive, deliberate loss of fluid, made the gorge rise in my throat. I followed the line of the painted path, my light tracing the blood-slick trajectory across the stone. At the terminus of the map, the light fell upon the floor, and there, beneath the final abstract drawing of the pit or door, was the definitive, sickening proof of the artist's presence. It wasn't a drawing this time. It was a small, tangible artifact. Lying on the damp stone, slightly coated in fine cave dust, was a child's object, a plush toy, small enough to fit in a coat pocket, recognizable as a cheaply made, brightly colored teddy bear, now dark and matted. I picked it up with the extreme caution of a crime scene investigator. It was cold, damp, and heavy, and smeared across the chest and the stitched face of the bear was the same sticky maroon substance. This wasn't a ritual. This wasn't some ancient warning. This was a distress signal. A child or children had been in this cave recently, desperately attempting to mark their location or route, using the only available medium they had left, their own lives. The final terrifying realization hit me with the force of a physical blow. These weren't random symbols. They were warnings. The spiky figures weren't ghosts. They were distorted representations of someone or something else. And the footprints didn't stop because the children turned back. They stopped because the children continued into a section of the cave that I hadn't yet reached, a section where the floor was likely solid rock or pooled water, holding no dust to record their passage. The silence of the cave, which I had briefly shattered, returned now with intensified menace, pressing in on my ears. I spun slowly, scanning the perimeter. There had to be an opening, a fissure, a deeper passage that the map was pointing toward. And then I saw it, a small, almost undetectable crack high up in the ceiling, a vertical shaft hidden behind a stalactite curtain, too small for an adult to climb through, but perfectly sized for a child. The air movement, subtle as it was, originated from there. That was the way forward, the route the children had taken, documented meticulously in blood on the wall below. I knew with absolute certainty that I had stumbled into a situation far outside the realm of lost hikers or seasonal vandalism. This was forensic horror. This was a vanishing act rendered in viscous arterial spray. I took the mandated photos of the toy and the final drawing, sealed the evidence in a sterile bag, and then, with trembling hands, I retrieved my satellite phone and my emergency distress beacon. I couldn't risk the structural collapse of the entrance I had used. It was the only way out, and I needed to ensure it remained clear for any potential rescue team. I quickly shored up the damaged concrete with the temporary supports I carried for such emergencies. My next step had to be communication, but the sheer absurdity of the report paralyzed me. Ranger Elias Thorne reports children's blood art and small toy found in closed cave 7A. Footprints lead inward. Who would believe that? They would ask where the children were reported missing. They would ask for confirmation of the blood type. They would ask if I had inhaled any noxious gases. I moved back slightly, seeking a better signal, the plush bear secured in my vest pocket, its terrible stained message radiating through the thick fabric. The transmission signal was weak, spotty, barely able to pierce the dense rock and forest canopy, but I needed to get the words out. The first word I typed into the restricted emergency log, the preamble before the coordinates and the detailed description of the evidence, was simple, damning, and terrifyingly clear. Missing. I knew I was about to cross a professional and existential line I couldn't uncross. I was the only person who knew the truth of the whispering mouth. And now I had to bring the light of the outside world down into this blackness, no matter the consequences. The drawings were finished, but the story was just beginning. The hunt was on. End of Part 1. Part 2 will detail the official response and the immediate escalation of the search efforts based on Ranger Thorne's findings. The air in the cave had begun to curdle. It wasn't just the overwhelming coppery ferrous stench that permeated everything, clinging to the damp rock and settling deep in my lungs. It was the sheer, crushing weight of the silence that followed the futile attempts to raise a signal. The satellite phone, my only tether to the civilized world, now sat on a narrow ledge, its screen blank, a useless black mirror reflecting the frantic, wide-eyed image of my face. The static that had punctuated my last broken sentence to dispatch, a garbled, desperate plea for immediate extraction and forensic support, had faded into an absolute, smothering quiet, broken only by the irregular drip of water somewhere far deeper within the limestone moor. I had forced myself to step back from the immediate vicinity of the gallery, retreating maybe 15 feet to where the beam of my headlamp fractured against a jagged column of stalagmite. I needed distance, not physical but psychological. I needed to convince myself that what I was witnessing, that vibrant, horrifying mural painted in a medium that should never have been touched by children, was somehow a trick of the light, a geological anomaly, or perhaps a hallucination brought on by the thin, recycled air and the lingering panic. But the cold certainty in the pit of my stomach, a knot of pure, unadulterated dread, refused to unravel. The drawings, however, were brutally clear, defying misinterpretation. My light swept over them again, reluctantly, tracing the lines burned into the rock face. They were relentless in their repetition, a cycle of torment played out again and again across the canvas of the ancient stone. The predominant figure was consistently crude yet unmistakable. A stick figure always taller than the others, lacking discernible facial features but often crowned with what looked like rudimentary horns or merely two aggressive spikes protruding from the head. This figure was always central, always dominant, and often depicted holding smaller, less detailed figures, the children, by the wrists, or sometimes, much worse, clutching them by their tiny, fragile necks. I noticed a specific motif recurring, one that made the nausea return with stomach-heaving intensity. In several places, the central figure was drawn with hands that possessed too many digits. Not 5, not 6, but sometimes 7 or 8 crude lines branching from the wrist, like the legs of a panicked spider, gripping the smaller victims. This was a child's artistic interpretation of extreme violence or fear, the distortion born of profound trauma, focusing on the instruments of pain. It wasn't just blood, it was living memory, distilled into the most gruesome iconography. The contextualization of this horror suddenly sharpened. I reached into my pack for the small ultraviolet flashlight, a tool I usually carried to track certain nocturnal insects or fungi, never expecting to use it to analyze human tragedy. I switched it on. The UV light, ghostly and blue, washed over the red pigments. And there, revealed under the different spectrum, was the horrifying confirmation I desperately didn't want. The blood wasn't uniformly old. Where some of the drawings, the oldest ones perhaps depicting the initial captivity or the first rituals, showed a deep, almost petrified black under the light. Others pulsed with a sickly, almost pink fluorescence. This suggested varying stages of decomposition and coagulation. In several spots, particularly along the bottom edges where the pigment had dripped, the material was so recent, so structurally intact, that it had barely begun to darken. It was, impossibly, still wet to the touch if I dared to reach out. I could not suppress the involuntary retch that escaped my throat, the sound swallowed immediately by the cavernous space. This wasn't an archaeological find, a horrifying snapshot of some centuries-old forgotten barbarism. This was a scene of active, ongoing trauma. The timeline of horror stretched right up to perhaps a few days ago, or even hours. The problem, the conflict that seized my ability to think clearly, was the silence. If these atrocities were happening now, or very recently, where were the perpetrators? Where were the victims? I swept the light around, the beam cutting through the dust motes dancing in the humid air. The cave floor here was mostly packed dirt and fine silt, soft enough to retain impressions. I began my forensic assessment, carefully using the thin beam of the light like a scalpel, and I found them. Footprints. There were 3 distinct sets. The first was mine, marked by the heavy tread of my issued boots. I ignored those. The second set was faint, small, and shallow. The undeniable impressions of barefoot children, scuffing the dirt, small heels digging in briefly. These prints crisscrossed the area near the drawings, suggesting they had been standing here for some time, perhaps forced to watch, perhaps forced to paint. But it was the third set that brought the sweat prickling cold on my neck. These prints were large, distinct and heavy, not booted but also barefoot or wearing some kind of soft, heavy moccasin. The impression of the heel was deep, indicating significant weight and deliberate measured movement. They didn't belong to a small person. They belonged to a large adult or perhaps several large adults. What was truly terrifying was the pattern. The large prints walked alongside the small prints, leading deeper into the subterranean maze. And just before the passageway narrowed too much for my comfort, there was a distinctive scuff mark, a long dragged line in the dirt as if something heavy or someone unconscious had been pulled. The open loops multiplied, screaming at me. Were these children kidnapped? Were they part of some insular, terrifying cult that forced its young into ritual bloodletting? The drawings themselves served as a chilling ledger, an inventory of suffering. One particular scene near the end of the visible gallery showed the tall figure standing over a small mound, arms raised in a jagged, celebratory gesture, while the small stick figure below it was drawn without limbs or a head, just a torso. An offering. A sacrifice. And the blood surrounding that particular image was horrifyingly fresh, the consistency almost gelatinous in the UV light. I backed away again, counting the seconds, trying to impose order on the chaos unraveling in my mind. I was a ranger, trained for search and rescue, for wildlife observation, for maintaining trails. I was not trained for this. This was monstrous. I needed to re-engage with the reality of my predicament. I was trapped here until morning, possibly longer if the weather deteriorated above ground, making helicopter extraction impossible. I had a choice: sit and tremble, waiting for rescue, or gather more evidence, risking an encounter with whoever was responsible for this nightmare. My duty, twisted and horrifying though it was, demanded the latter. I could not abandon these children, even if they were only spectral presences now, trapped in the crimson strokes on the walls. I took a deep, shuddering breath, the metallic air scraping my throat, and focused my light on the intricate details of the murals, pushing past the overwhelming fear of the blood's proximity. I started cataloguing the images mentally, trying to find a narrative progression, a timeline. The initial drawings showed simple acts, the large figure leading the small figures, always in a line. Then came the scenes of restraint, the 7-fingered hands holding firm. But halfway through the gallery, a profound pattern interrupt occurred. There was one drawing, unique among all the crude horror, that possessed a shocking, almost artistic detail. It was slightly larger than the others, occupying a small, smooth section of rock. It depicted not stick figures, but recognizable faces. These were not the flat, featureless ovals of the other figures. These were round, defined features, drawn with a thick, almost paste-like concentration of the crimson pigment. And the eyes. The eyes were terrifyingly rendered. Huge, disproportionate circles, wide open, not just staring, but fixed in an expression of absolute, paralyzing terror. Below this face, the artist had added a single perfectly rendered tear track, drawn in what looked like clear fluid mixed with the blood, perhaps saliva or actual tears, preserved in the mixture. And next to this detailed face, there was a scribble that wasn't part of the drawing itself, but looked like an attempt at writing. It was phonetic, clearly the attempt of a child who was just learning to form words. I traced the shapes with my gloved finger, repeating the sound in my mind. L. The last character was an impossible mashup, but the implication was clear. A name. A cry for help translated into paint and pigment, drawn in the thick medium of their own pain. This detail, this shift in quality and intent, suggested that one child had either greater artistic ability or perhaps more horrifyingly, had been forced to witness and memorialize the suffering of another. This realization drove me forward. I had to follow the footprints. They led away from the gallery into a side passage that seemed barely large enough for a person to squeeze through, an entrance I had initially dismissed as a geological fissure. I adjusted my harness, took my heavy-duty flashlight and started to crawl. The passage was narrow, confining, forcing me to move sideways, scraping against the damp, cold limestone. It smelled worse here, the metallic scent of blood mixed with a heavy, earthy odor, like churned soil and rot. After what felt like an eternity of agonizing claustrophobia, the passage opened into a small cylindrical chamber, a dome-like space about 10 feet across. My powerful beam swept the area. This was not a dwelling. This was a staging area. The floor was flat, packed smooth, and in the very center I saw the true re-engagement with horror, a small, ordinary object, impossibly out of place. It was a brightly colored plastic hair clip, shaped like a clumsy cartoon butterfly, pink and blue, slightly dusty but otherwise intact. A cheap accessory, the kind a mother might grab at a supermarket checkout line. It was modern, undeniably from the world above. It had belonged to one of the children. My heart hammered against my ribs, a painful, frantic drumming. These weren't ancient spirits or cryptic cave paintings left by forgotten primitives. These were modern children, missing, suffering, or worse. I moved forward, stepping carefully around the clip, my light darting everywhere. The walls here had no drawings, but the floor was stained. Not just dirt, but long, dark, smeared puddles that had been partially scraped clean, then smeared again. And then I saw it. The true sickening climax of this second descent, tucked into a small naturally occurring niche, shielded from the entrance, was not a body, but a collection. A wooden basin, crudely carved, rested on a flat stone. It was heavy, and within it, congealed into a terrifying, dark, viscous mass, was a substantial volume of blood. This was the source, the reservoir for the paintings, perhaps the ritual focus itself. Next to the basin, resting against the rock, was a small cloth-bound book the size of a ledger. It looked like an ordinary cheap accountant's notebook, the kind you buy for $2 at a convenience store. It was utterly incompatible with the primal horror surrounding it. My hands were shaking violently as I carefully lifted the book, trying not to disturb the dust or smear the cover. The cover was plain navy blue. I flicked the light across the pages, and my eyes struggled to make sense of the neat, almost meticulous handwriting inside, the careful cursive of an educated adult. It wasn't a diary, it was a log. The first page I saw detailed a date, June 4th, 2023, followed by a specific reference, L subject, age 7, reluctant at first, later cooperative. The tribute was accepted. Below it was a description of the tribute, detailing volume and method, referencing specific anatomical locations, details too precise, too clinical for anything other than deliberate, calculated sadism. The neatness of the writing contrasted so violently with the monstrous content that it created a vertigo of revulsion. I flipped through the pages rapidly, scanning the years. The entries were consistent, chillingly regular. They were documented sacrifices, chronicled by an individual who saw themselves not as a predator, but as a meticulous ritual servant. And then I hit the final entry, marked just 3 days prior. Subject V, age 6, very weak, the essence is failing. A full reenactment required to ensure the purity of the offering. The 7-fingered one demands completion. My breath caught in a soundless gasp. The 7-fingered one was the figure in the drawings. This ledger confirmed that the horrific iconography was not delusion. It was documentation, a ritual manual, a log of ongoing ritualistic murder or severe abuse stretching back years. This was not a cold case. This was an active hunter, and if Subject 5 was very weak, they could still be nearby. My conclusion hit me with the force of a physical blow. I wasn't just investigating a crime scene. I was standing in the middle of a killer's operational base, and the killer knew the cave. I didn't. Suddenly, the absolute silence that had oppressed me moments ago broke. It wasn't the drip of water. It was a faint scraping sound from the narrow entrance passage, the sound of something large dragging itself through the silt, approaching the chamber. My heart seized. The sound was measured, heavy, and deliberate. It was the sound of the same large, heavy tread whose prints I had followed. I was trapped. The exit was blocked. I had the book, the unholy ledger, in my hand. I had to get out. I had to deliver this. I spun around, my light searching desperately for another fissure, another way out of the small, dome-like room. There was none. I heard the scuffing again, closer this time, accompanied by a low, rough exhalation. Whatever it was rounding the final bend, entering the small tunnel leading directly to me. I gripped the heavy flashlight and the ledger, preparing to sell the small amount of time I had left very, very dearly. If I died here, the truth of the seven-fingered one would be buried with me. I had to deliver this document. I had to escape. I urge you, reader, to prepare yourself for the next installment. The contents of this ledger, the full, systematic horror it details, must be revealed, and you must know how I escaped the chamber, and what I found when I realized the perpetrator had not just entered the cave. They had been following me since the moment I stepped inside. The reports came back as cold and clinical as I expected them to be, a slap in the face delivered by the sterile certainty of bureaucracy. They labeled the initial samples, the ones I had painstakingly scraped and catalogued with trembling hands, as highly degraded organic residue, primarily ferric oxide mixed with localized concentrations of mammalian protein. They refused to confirm it was human blood, based solely on the preliminary spectroscopic analysis, hedging their bets with phrases like potential large animal source, or the sickeningly dismissive suggestion of complex organic staining from historical indigenous mineral use. They treated my urgent, near-hysterical calls, the ones detailing the unmistakable structure of childish terror rendered in sticky, dark crimson, as the ravings of a fatigued park employee suffering from environmental stress and hypoxia. They wanted closure, a signature on a form, and a return to the placid, predictable rhythm of managing hikers and counting elk populations. They did not want the truth which lay miles deep beneath the earth, suffocating in perpetual darkness, and smelling overwhelmingly of copper and impending doom. I signed nothing. I told no one else. The silence of my colleagues was now indistinguishable from the silence of the cave, a heavy, absolute presence that pressed against my eardrums until I felt nauseous. They had closed the case before it ever opened, citing a lack of viable physical evidence corresponding to any missing persons reports within the last 50 years. 50 years. The irony was a bitter taste that mingled with the metallic tang that now seemed permanently lodged in the back of my throat, an echo of the cave's horrible medium. So, I went back. Not as Ranger Elias Thorne, official custodian of protected lands, but as a man haunted, driven by a horrifying, singular conviction. I traded the official investigative gear for my personal climbing harness, my best headlamp, and a specialized portable spectrometer I purchased under a false name, shipped to a post office box 60 miles away. I began my true documentation, meticulous and obsessive, focused on the subtle, horrifying evolution of the drawings themselves. The assumption that cave paintings, even modern macabre ones, are static records of a moment in time, is fundamentally flawed when dealing with this specific horror. On my first unauthorized return trip, exactly 36 hours after the official all-clear memo, I noticed the change. It was minute, nearly undetectable to the casual observer, but I had memorized every arc, every splash, every finger-painted smear. The drawing I mentally catalogued as the Circle of Hands, located on the northern curve of Chamber B3, had gained definition. The lines were not merely drying, they were thickening. Where the initial rendering had been thin, almost watery in its application, the edges of the tiny, childish palms now possessed a raised, granular texture, as if the drying process was drawing material from the porous rock itself, concentrating the pigment, or perhaps adding to it. I spent 6 hours mapping the minute coordinates of 3 key drawings using lasers and highly sensitive thermal imaging. The temperature of the rock directly beneath the darkest pools of pigment was consistently a few tenths of a degree lower than the surrounding limestone, an anomaly I couldn't explain geologically. It felt like the drawings were leaching heat, or maybe perpetually cooling from some recent, desperate action. The smell intensified with each visit, becoming less about iron and more about the sickly sweet decay that suggests biological breakdown halted just shy of putrefaction. It was the smell of plasma separated from the cellular matter, preserved by the cave's chill yet still somehow fresh. The deeper I went, the more complex the acoustic environment became. The cave was always profoundly silent, but now there was a specific, localized vibration that seemed to follow my helmet lamp. It wasn't a draft or water dripping, but a deep, resonant hum low enough that I felt it first in my chest cavity, then in the vibration of my teeth. It was a frequency that defied natural origin in that environment. I tried recording it, but the resulting audio file was corrupted every single time, replaced by pure white noise exactly where the humming was loudest. It was a deliberate pattern interrupt, a physical obstruction to my investigation, implemented by something unseen, perhaps even acoustic. I started focusing intensely on the recurring symbols. The stick figures were universally unsettling, depicting postures of profound distress and unnatural contortion, yet they possessed a terrifying consistency. But within the drawings, amidst the chaos, there was a repeated motif. A small crimson triangle nestled inside a circle, always positioned near the apex of the larger composition. On my fourth trip, equipped with high-powered magnification, I realized this symbol wasn't drawn freehand. It was inscribed with the precision of a tool, a sharp point pressed deeply into the rock before the blood was applied over it. This meant premeditation, organization, and a method far removed from the panicked, frenzied actions of trapped children. Who was guiding this? This symbol, the red mark, became my focus. It didn't correspond to any known local tribal iconography. It wasn't Masonic, alchemical, or related to any local cult activity I could find in historical archives. Yet it was undeniably present, acting like a signature. I spent 3 days holed up in my cabin, surrounded by dusty books on forgotten civilizations and astronomical charts, tracing lines of inquiry that made less and less sense. Then the breakthrough came, not from history, but from the stars. The red mark was not a random geometric shape. It was a highly stylized, inverted representation of the constellation Draco, specifically pointing towards the star Thuban, the pole star of 4,000 years ago. The children, or whoever was utilizing them, were not just drawing the immediate present. They were anchoring their horror to a deep, archaic astronomical reference, tying their actions to a cycle of time that dwarfed human history. This wasn't merely a crime scene, it was an altar tied to a cosmic calendar. This realization that the complexity of the operation far exceeded simple kidnapping and murder sent a fresh jolt of primal terror through me. I was dealing with something exponentially more organized and disturbing than I could possibly handle. The drawings, I understood now, were not retrospective accounts of suffering. They were a roadmap, perhaps even a countdown. My next descent was heavier. I carried a field chemistry kit, determined to confirm the biological origin, bypassing the FBI's timid reporting. I took samples from 3 different locations: the Circle of Hands, B3, the tally marks, C1, and the labyrinth, C5. The journey to C5, the deepest chamber I had yet investigated, was harrowing. The path narrowed severely, forcing me to squeeze through tight fissures where the limestone pressed against my chest, the air turning dense and cold, carrying a faint, unmistakable scent of methane mixed with the metallic odor. When I finally emerged into chamber C5, I had to suppress a gasp. The air here was so frigid it burned my lungs, and the walls were covered not just in drawings, but in what looked like layered scrapings, as if someone had repeatedly tried to remove the evidence, only to have the medium reappear, or perhaps reapplied. The labyrinth drawing itself was vast, covering nearly 40 square feet, a complex looping pattern interspersed with the stick figures, all moving toward a single central point. It was here, in the oppressive silence of C5, that I found the absolute proof that destroyed the historical artifact theory and plunged the timeline firmly into the agonizing present. Deep within a narrow crevice, directly beneath the labyrinth drawing's epicenter, nestled against the damp cave floor, was a tiny, impossible object. I used tongs to carefully retrieve it. It was a single button, Not bone, not rock, not dried organic material, but a button made of glossy, injection-molded plastic. It was the specific, easily recognizable type used on mass-produced children's outerwear, a bright robin's egg blue, slightly scuffed but perfectly intact. On the reverse side, faintly legible, was the manufacturer's mark, a logo I knew intimately from seeing it countless times on the back-to-school racks. Kids Harbour Outfitters, Eston 2012. The drawings were not decades old. They were recent, very recent. The sheer volume of material applied to these walls implied a continued presence, an ongoing, monstrous ritual. And this tiny blue piece of synthetic evidence proved that the victims, or at least the material used to tell their terrifying story, were of the contemporary world. The blood that painted the walls was the blood of children who had worn jackets bought last season. I stood there, the weight of the darkness compounded by the horrifying modernity of the button. The low-frequency hum was louder now, vibrating painfully in my sinuses. My professional composure shattered completely. I started frantically searching the immediate area, scraping away the loose sediment. I had to find the source. If the button was here, the point of collection, the genesis of the horror, must be nearby. I didn't find bodies, or bones, or even remnants of clothing. What I found was a pit, cleverly concealed beneath a shelf of calcite flowstone. It was unnaturally smooth, carved, not eroded, and incredibly deep. I shone my light down, estimating the depth at nearly 50 feet. At the bottom, nothing but dark water and a sickening shimmer. But along the lip of the pit, the rock was stained a deep, saturated black, far darker than the drawings on the wall. And the smell here was overwhelming. Pure iron, sharp and acrid, mixed with that high-tension fear scent. This was the reservoir. This was where the life was harvested, contained, perhaps even processed, before being used to paint the awful narrative above. As I leaned closer, documenting the deep-cut marks into the stone lip, marks that suggested a bucket or vessel being repeatedly dragged across the edge, the low hum intensified until it was almost painful. The shadow cast by my own helmet lamp seemed to stretch and distort unnaturally, momentarily coalescing into a shape too tall, too thin, against the opposite wall. A pattern interrupt, immediate and overwhelming. My flashlight flickered violently, not because the battery was dying, but as if some external electromagnetic field was aggressively interfering. Then the light died completely, plunging me into absolute starless dark, 70 feet below the surface. I wasn't just in the dark, I was in the complete, overwhelming absence of light and sound, save for the persistent, deafening vibration in my own skull. And then, through the paralyzing silence, a new sound manifested, wet and close. It was a small, dragging noise, like something heavy and soft being pulled slowly across the smooth, damp limestone floor, starting from the perimeter of the vast, terrifying labyrinth mural in Chamber C5. It was moving toward me, inexorably, in the pitch black. I gripped the tongs holding the blue button, my only proof, my only connection to the rational world, and realized with chilling certainty that I had overstayed my welcome. I was no longer an investigator. I was an intruder on an active, ongoing, and very present ritual. The drawings were not waiting for me to solve them. They were waiting for me to join them. The deep cold of the chamber suddenly felt like the cold grip of something alive. I had gone too deep, seen too much, and now the artists were coming home. The dragging sound stopped, and a single shallow breath, impossibly close, whistled against the back of my neck. The blood has dried, but the horror has not concluded. Stay with me for the final part of this descent, where the light finally breaks and the cost of the truth is tallied. The air had thickened into something viscous, heavy with the scent of ozone and the mineral tang of old dried blood, now subtly refreshed by the humidity dripping from the ceiling. Every inhalation felt like swallowing dust mixed with copper filings. The humming, which had been a distant phenomenon, an academic curiosity linked to geological stresses, was no longer external. It was internal. It vibrated in my sternum, resonated in the fluid of my inner ear, and hammered against the fragile architecture of my sanity. My head pounded in sync with the subterranean drone, a metronome counting down to a conclusion I instinctively knew would be definitive, horrific, and absolute. I was deep within the labyrinth now, far beyond the official map markers, navigating only by the repetition of the children's crimson iconography. The drawings weren't just art, they were waypoints, dreadful instructions for an itinerary of doom. The path narrowed severely here, forcing me to move sideways, scraping the abrasive sandstone that felt strangely warm despite the cave's general chill. The beam of my headlamp danced frenetically, catching the glittering moisture on the walls, making the ancient, desiccated patterns of the blood paint appear to shift and writhe. It was here in this suffocating passage that the distinction between the history of the horror and the immediacy of the threat vanished entirely. The drawings stopped being ancient relics. They became fresh declarations. The final image, repeated dozens of times along the choke point, was always the same, a downward-pointing chevron leading directly into a profound, gaping blackness. And surrounding that chevron, always the small, stylized human figures holding hands, melting into a crimson spiral. They weren't just indicating a destination, they were illustrating the method of transit. My heart hammered against my ribs, a trapped bird desperate for the daylight I had left so far behind. My radio was useless, a persistent static hiss that sounded suspiciously like a whisper, fighting to break through the white noise, a sound that only increased the overwhelming sense of isolation. I was utterly alone, committed to the descent into the source of the terrible red ink. The tunnel finally released me into a space that defied the geological characteristics of the entire national park. It was a cathedral of stone, impossibly vast, not carved by water erosion but shaped by millennia of profound, crushing pressure. The floor was not the usual slick mud or loose gravel, but smooth, polished shale, almost unnaturally flat, sloping gently towards a central depression. The acoustics in this chamber were nightmarish. The hum was amplified tenfold, transforming into a roar that didn't assault the ears but seemed to vibrate the very skeleton, shaking the foundations of my perception. I felt nauseous, dizzy, unable to trust the ground beneath my feet. It was in the center of this titanic chamber, where the sheer, suffocating scale of the cave system culminated, that I found the culmination of the terror. It wasn't a drawing this time. It was a pedestal, or perhaps more accurately, a massive, crudely formed altar, a single black slab of volcanic rock that looked alien and misplaced within the sedimentary layers of the cave. And upon this slab, and surrounding it in vast concentric circles, was the blood. It wasn't dried. It was impossibly, horribly wet. The coppery stench here was overwhelming, powerful enough to sting the nostrils and bring tears to my eyes. It coated the air like a veil. The blood had been recently spilled, pooling into shallow reservoirs in the polished shale, viscous and dark against the grey stone. It pulsed slightly in the ambient vibration of the earth, mimicking the slow rhythmic expansion and contraction of some colossal submerged organ. This was the terminus. This was the source of the terrible pigment, not residue from 50 years ago, but the horrifying evidence of a continuous, ongoing cycle, the pattern I had seen the children drawing, the spiral, the chevron, the shepherd, sleeper figure, was all leading here, to this nexus of raw, vital fluid. My breath hitched, catching in my throat a dry, rasping sound swallowed instantly by the roaring hum. My headlamp beam, shaky and weak against the immensity of the space, finally illuminated the center of the altar itself. It wasn't empty. Resting on the black slab was an object that defied classification, not biological, not technological, but something horrifyingly organic and profoundly ancient. It was roughly crystalline, massive, pulsating with a dull internal luminescence that struggled against the darkness. It was imperfectly symmetrical, composed of interlocking dark facets that absorbed light but seemed to leak the sound. It was the source of the deep, debilitating drone. It was generating that seismic vibration, that low-frequency thrum that eroded memory and fractured the will. And then I saw the details, the impossible sanity-shattering details that closed every open loop with a sickening snap. The crystal was not simply resting there, it was anchored. It was tethered to the slab by slender, almost invisible strands that weren't mineral or root, but impossibly thin, pale, ossified structures, the calcified remnants of small human fingers. Around the altar, Embedded haphazardly into the dark, wet shale were dozens of small scattered objects glinting dully in the light. Toys. A worn wooden soldier, a porcelain doll missing one eye, a rusted tin whistle, and a stack of school slates, the kind used decades ago. The artifacts of lost innocence, the physical proof of the disappearances. The children hadn't been victims of a random accident or a single tragic cult. They had been compelled. They had been drawn here not by human malice, but by the relentless psychic call of this subterranean relic, this sleeper. The drawings, the horrifying depictions of the ritual, weren't expressions of terror, but maps, blueprints, and records created under duress. The blood wasn't just paint, it was the fuel. The sleeper, or whatever this colossal, vibrating crystal entity was, required a specific resonance, a purity of energy extracted through a ritual that involved the ultimate terror and despair of the innocent. It was sustained by the literal life force, channeled through the blood to maintain its seismic hibernation. I stumbled backward, my boots splashing in the thick, wet pools of coppery red. The hum peaked, the entire chamber seeming to warp under the pressure. I realized with paralyzing dread that the children hadn't stopped coming simply because the entity stopped calling. The disappearances stopped being reported because the victims were no longer linked to obvious civilian movements. The cycle was perpetual. It was maintained either by other lost souls or, perhaps horrifyingly, by some hidden group, the descendants of the original cultists, who had understood the imperative and continued the stewardship of this underground horror. The shepherd wasn't the entity. The shepherd was the caretaker, the one who ensured the supply line. My investigative curiosity was annihilated, replaced by the instinctual, primal urge to survive. This was not a mystery to be solved. It was a cosmic wound to be avoided. Every fiber of my being screamed that if I stayed, the vibration would claim me, strip away my awareness, and perhaps convert my own lifeblood into the next offering. The intense low-frequency noise was doing more than just inducing nausea. It was eroding the will, planting the suggestion of repose, of simply lying down in the thick, warm pools and giving in to the relentless, comforting drone. I scrambled away from the altar, stumbling blindly back toward the narrow passage, the echo of the children's final ritual ringing in my mind. The horror wasn't the past. The horror was the eternity of the entity. It had been slumbering, feeding, and resonating for eons, using the purest, most terrifying resource it could summon from the surface world. I didn't run. I clawed my way out. The return journey was a nightmare of disorientation and physical collapse. I moved purely on adrenaline and the frantic terror that the hum would follow me, that the cold, insistent call of the sleeper would hook into my mind and drag me back. I barely registered the familiar red drawings on the ascent, seeing them now not as clues, but as dreadful frescoes detailing the fate that awaited anyone who ventured too deep. They were beautiful in their execution and utterly, fundamentally evil in their purpose. When I finally broke free of the main cave mouth, staggering out into the thin, high-altitude air of the park, I collapsed onto the pine needle-covered earth, gasping for breath. The silence was deafening, a sudden, blessed absence of the subterranean roar. The sunlight, harsh and golden through the canopy, felt alien, a fraudulent facade over a world built on profound geological cruelty. I lay there for what felt like hours, shaking, tasting copper and dust. The image of the pulsating black crystal and the ossified fingers burned into my retinas. I eventually gathered myself, retrieving the emergency satellite phone from my pack, my hands trembling violently. My immediate task was clear: report the horror, call for help, notify the authorities of the fresh blood and the ritual site. But the moment I opened my mouth to speak, the words caught. How could I articulate this? How could I tell the superintendent or the sheriff or the bureau that I had found an impossibly ancient, vibrating, crystalline entity that fed on the life force of missing children through blood rituals spanning 50 years, possibly longer? I tried, whispering the facts into the static-laced line. I found them. The children. The blood is fresh. There's a structure. Deep underground. It's not natural. The response, predictably, was measured skepticism laced with concern for my mental state. They heard the hysteria in my voice, the fragmented account of things that defied geological and forensic science. They would send a team, they promised, but their primary concern was my own immediate extraction and medical evaluation. They heard hallucination and exposure. They heard breakdown. They did not hear ancient sacrificial earth heart. I knew with chilling clarity what would happen next. They would send the official search and rescue team, men accustomed to broken ankles and lost hikers. They would not find the small, narrow passage I had squeezed through. They wouldn't follow the dreadful roadmap of the blood drawings. And even if they did, the entity, the sleeper, had likely already retreated, withdrawing its immediate presence, waiting for the seismic reverberations of the surface world to settle back into complacency. The blood would dry. The evidence would be dismissed as geological anomaly, or perhaps the residue of old bizarre rituals, conveniently closing the file on the mad park ranger. I never led the team back down. I couldn't. The thought of bringing others, of exposing them to the resonant hum and the temptation of the void was unbearable. More importantly, the fear that the entity was aware now that it had felt my prying presence and was waiting. For me to return with fresh offerings was paralyzing. My final act as a ranger was one of betrayal and preservation. I spent the next 3 days hiking the perimeter, burying every single entrance point I knew of that led into the deepest layers of the system. I sealed the mouth of the Whispering Moor with strategically placed rockfalls, making it appear as a natural collapse, using my knowledge of the regional fault lines to make the barrier seem immutable, permanent. I destroyed the official survey maps detailing the lower caves. I lied in my reports. I claimed that the deepest exploration had been hampered by a massive natural collapse, confirming the geological theory that the depth was unstable and unsafe for future recreational or research entry. I resigned shortly thereafter, citing unforeseen emotional distress and occupational fatigue. I left the park I had sworn to protect, carrying only the absolute certainty of the horror I had witnessed. The weight of that secret, the knowledge that beneath the serene beauty of the wilderness, an immense ancient mechanism of horror continues its slow, rhythmic demand for innocent lifeblood, is a burden that never dissipates. The children's drawings were not ghosts or historical markers. They were proof of a perpetual subterranean tyranny. And the sleeper is still down there, vibrating, waiting for the surface world to forget, waiting for the cycle to begin again, demanding its dreadful pigment. My life is now dedicated to ensuring that the entrance remains sealed, that the horror sleeps undisturbed. But every now and then, late at night, when the silence of my small, isolated cabin is absolute, I can still feel it. A faint, deep, mesmerizing thrumming in my chest cavity, a gentle, insistent vibration calling me home to the red altar. If you ever encounter a cave system that resonates, that pulses with a deep, low-frequency hum, turn back. Do not document. Do not investigate. Do not seek the origin of the sound. If you find drawings made in any color resembling dried earth or rust, leave immediately and seal the way behind you, no matter the cost or the explanation you have to invent. Because if you follow that horrific artwork to its inevitable conclusion, you will find that the drawings were never finished, and the artist is still waiting for the final wet signature. Protect the innocent ignorance of the world, even if it means lying to those you trust. Do not wake the sleeper.